The wind blew through the cemetery, sharp and cold, swirling the autumn leaves in its wake. The gravestones stood like silent sentinels, watching over the land. Among them, a lone figure stood, his broad shoulders hunched beneath the weight of grief. His eyes were empty, haunted, as they traced the name etched into the stone before him: Sarah Whitmore. The soldier's hand trembled as he reached out to touch the cold marble. His fingers traced the letters, each one a painful reminder of the love he had lost. His chest tightened, and the ache inside him grew with each passing second. The years had not dulled the pain. If anything, it had only deepened. His wife, his love, gone. He hadn't been there when she needed him most. He had been away, caught in the endless battle of war, leaving her alone. He had promised to protect her, to come home, but now all he had left was this cold stone and the memories that would never fade. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. He had told her he would return. He hadn't. A low growl interrupted his thoughts, and he turned to see his loyal German shepherd, Rex, standing beside him. The dog's ears were perked, its eyes alert as it watched the surrounding area. The bond between the soldier and his K9 had been forged through years of service together. They had fought side by side, and Rex had always been there for him, offering comfort and protection when the world felt too dark. The soldier knelt beside Rex, his hand resting on the dog's fur. "It's okay, boy," he murmured. "I just need a minute." Rex sat down, its eyes never leaving the soldier, as if understanding the weight of the moment. The two of them shared an unspoken connection, one forged in the heat of battle, and one that would carry them through whatever came next. But as the soldier lingered at the grave, something caught his eye in the distance. A small figure stood near the edge of the cemetery, half hidden behind a row of gravestones. The figure was hunched down, clutching something tightly in her arms. The soldier squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. It was a little girl, no more than 6 years old. She wore a tattered coat, its edges frayed, and her messy brown hair hung in knots around her face. Her eyes were wide with fear, and her small frame trembled in the cold. Rex growled softly, standing up, its body tense. The soldier stood as well, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle slung across his back. But he didn't draw it. The girl didn't seem to pose a threat. The soldier took a cautious step forward, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Hey, you okay?" he called, his voice soft but firm. The little girl froze, her wide eyes locking onto him. She said nothing, just stood there, clutching what appeared to be a small, stuffed bear in her arms. The soldier took another step forward, his concern growing. "What's your name?" he asked gently. Still the girl didn't respond. Instead, she took a hesitant step toward him, her feet barely making a sound on the cold ground. She was close now, so close that he could see the dirt and grime on her clothes. Her face was streaked with tears, and the sadness in her eyes reminded him of the emptiness he felt every day. Then, to his surprise, the girl whispered, "Can I clean your house for a plate of leftovers?" The soldier's heart skipped a beat. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. It was a question so innocent, yet so painful. This child, abandoned, alone, was offering herself in exchange for the most basic of needs, a plate of food, a roof over her head. The soldier didn't know what to say. He wasn't sure if the girl was real or a figment of his grief-stricken mind. She looked so fragile, like she could vanish at any moment. But before he could respond, Rex barked, a sharp, low growl that broke the silence. The dog's body was tense, and its eyes were fixed on the girl with an intensity the soldier had never seen before. Rex had always been protective, but now it seemed to sense something the soldier didn't. The little girl took a step back, her eyes flicking nervously between the soldier and the dog. "Please," she whispered, "I'm so hungry." The soldier's heart shattered at her words. He didn't know how to help her. He didn't even know how to help himself. But he couldn't turn her away. Not like this. not when her voice cracked with so much desperation. "Stay right there," the soldier said, his voice breaking. He turned toward the K9, his face full of concern. "Rex, stay." Rex whined, but remained rooted, its watchful eyes never leaving the girl. The soldier reached into his backpack, pulling out the last of the bread and a small tin of meat. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He turned back toward the girl, his heart heavy with the weight of her innocence. "Here," he said, his hand shaking as he offered her the food. "This is all I have, but it's yours." The little girl hesitated, her eyes flicking between the soldier and the food. Then, slowly, she took a step forward and accepted the offering. Her hands were cold, trembling as she took the bread. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm sorry. I didn't know who else to ask." The soldier felt a lump form in his throat. She didn't need to apologize. She was just a child, doing whatever she could to survive. Before he could speak again, the girl whispered something that sent a chill down his spine. "Daddy's not dead," she said softly, her eyes filled with a deep sadness. "He's out there." "I know he is." The soldier's heart stopped. He looked down at the girl, his mind racing. Did she know something? Was this a sign? He wasn't sure, but the way she spoke made it feel like the world was shifting beneath his feet. Suddenly, Rex barked sharply, its tail stiff and its body coiled in alert. The soldier spun around, instinctively reaching for his rifle, but there was no immediate danger. Still, something was off. "What did you say?" the soldier asked, his voice hoarse, struggling to process the girl's words. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, but there was no fear. "I know my daddy's out there," she whispered again, her voice almost pleading. Before the soldier could respond, the K9 barked again, louder this time, its body tense and alert. And then he heard it, footsteps, faint but unmistakable, crunching in the snow. Someone was coming. Mark's heart raced. They weren't alone. The footsteps grew louder as the soldier's heart pounded in his chest. His rifle was already in his hand, though the weight of it felt heavier than usual. The moment felt surreal. He had just met a mysterious girl, one whose words hinted at an unimaginable truth, and now the danger he had feared was closing in on them again. "Rex," the soldier muttered under his breath, his voice low but commanding. "Stay sharp." The German shepherd growled once, its ears flicking back and forth, nose twitching as it stood at attention. The dog's eyes, once soft and trusting, were now narrowed, scanning the perimeter of the graveyard. Mark, the soldier, had trained with Rex for years. Together, they had faced every kind of threat imaginable, but this felt different. The air was thick with tension. The little girl stood motionless, her eyes fixed on the approaching noise. She clutched her teddy bear so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her small frame shook, whether from the cold or fear, Mark couldn't tell. "What do you know about your father?" Mark asked, his voice softer now, trying to steady himself. His heart was pounding harder than it had in a long time, but he kept his eyes on the girl, searching for answers. "What did you mean when you said Daddy's not dead?" The little girl didn't answer right away. She looked up at him, her big brown eyes full of sorrow, but also something else, something that Mark couldn't place. "Daddy went away," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "He said he'd come back, but he didn't." She paused, swallowing hard. "But I know he's out there, waiting for me." Mark took a deep breath, his mind racing. The girl's words haunted him. Could it be possible? Could her father still be alive out there? And if so, what had happened to him? The sound of footsteps grew louder, too close now for comfort. Mark's eyes darted toward the trees in the distance, where the shadows of approaching figures moved through the snowstorm. They weren't alone anymore. Whoever was coming wasn't looking to pass by. "Get down!" Mark said urgently, his voice sharp, as he grabbed the girl by the shoulder and pulled her down behind a snow-covered gravestone. He quickly signaled for Rex to follow them, and the dog moved silently beside him, the wind whipping through its fur. Ruth, the soldier's wife, had passed away a few years ago, but Mark still remembered the first time they had met. She had always been the calm to his storm, the anchor when the weight of the world pressed down on his shoulders. The loss of her still felt fresh, like a wound that never truly healed. But now, with the little girl at his side, something in him stirred, a protective instinct that was stronger than any grief he had known. "Stay quiet," he whispered to the girl, her tiny form trembling in his arms. The girl nodded, her eyes wide with fear, but she didn't say anything more. She held on to her teddy bear as though it were the only thing tethering her to a world that felt cold and uncertain. Mark kept his attention focused on the figures now making their way into the graveyard, their movements slow but deliberate. He recognized the silhouette of one of them, his old military comrade, the one he had trusted, now standing with a group of men, all armed and clearly searching for something. "Keen," Mark muttered under his breath. The name sent a shiver down his spine. Keen had been a part of Mark's old unit, but over time his loyalty had wavered. Now, it seemed, Keen had turned to darker dealings, ones that had cost Mark more than he could bear. And now he was back, leading a group of soldiers, intent on finding something or someone. Mark's eyes narrowed. He had to act fast. "Rex, go!" Mark commanded. The dog nodded, its tail stiff as it darted off into the snow, circling around the group of soldiers from behind, as Mark had trained it to do. Mark turned back to the little girl, kneeling in front of her. "You need to listen to me," he said softly, keeping his voice calm. "I'm going to protect you, but I need you to stay quiet. You have to trust me, okay?" The girl nodded, her hands shaking as she hugged her teddy bear even tighter. Mark felt a pang of guilt for involving her in this, but there was no time to explain, no time to make sense of the whirlwind of events that had brought them here. The soldiers were getting closer now, their boots crunching in the snow. Mark moved silently behind a gravestone, taking cover. He had to think fast. The last thing he wanted was to put the little girl in harm's way. Keen's men wouldn't hesitate to kill anyone who got in their way. As the soldiers passed by, Mark's heart beat in his throat. They were just feet away. But then something caught his attention. Keen was speaking. "I know you're here," Keen called out, his voice low but forceful. "I'll give you one chance, Sergeant. Come out, and we can make this easy." Mark's eyes flicked to the girl beside him. Her wide eyes were filled with a mix of confusion and fear. She didn't know who Keen was or what he meant, but Mark knew. This wasn't just a man hunting them down. Keen had a purpose. Keen's eyes narrowed as he scanned the gravestones, his gaze landing on the small movement in the corner of his vision, Rex, silently watching him from behind a cluster of trees. Rex barked loudly, its powerful voice echoing through the graveyard. The moment was lost. Mark's heart raced as Keen turned sharply toward the sound. He didn't have a choice anymore. "Run!" Mark shouted to the girl, pulling her hand as he sprinted toward the trees. "Run!" The girl didn't hesitate. Her tiny legs pushed through the snow, her hand still clutched tightly in his. Mark's rifle was ready, but he knew that if they didn't escape soon, there would be no way out. Behind them, Keen's men followed, and the chase began. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as the sound of pursuing footsteps grew louder behind him. The wind howled through the trees, the storm intensifying, but all he could hear was the rhythmic crunch of boots in the snow, drawing closer, step by step. The little girl, whose tiny hand was clutched tightly in his, stumbled over the snow-covered ground, her breath coming in quick, panicked gasps. Mark's mind raced as he calculated their next move. The trees were dense here, thick with snow, but that wouldn't stop Keen's men. Not with their experience. They'd be on them any second. He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes narrowing as he saw the shadows of Keen's men moving through the storm. The soldiers were closing in faster than he expected. The girl's fragile body beside him felt like the only thing that mattered in the world. He couldn't let her down. "Keep up!" Mark shouted, urging her forward as they sprinted through the dense forest. His boots sank deep into the snow, but he barely felt it. His focus was entirely on the girl, the only thing keeping her from falling into the hands of men who wouldn't hesitate to use her as a pawn in their twisted game. Rex was ahead of them now, darting between trees, its fur bristling as it moved with purpose. Mark had no doubt that the K9 was already planning their escape route. Rex was smarter than most soldiers, and the bond they shared went beyond simple command. It was a connection built on trust, one that had saved their lives more times than Mark cared to count. The girl's feet were slowing. Her small body was already exhausted from the running, her breath ragged, her face pale with the cold. Mark could see the fear in her eyes, the raw emotion written across her face. She was a child who had been through more than any person her age should have to endure. "We're almost there," Mark said through gritted teeth, his voice thick with exertion. He could see Rex ahead, barking softly to encourage them to keep moving, but just as they neared the edge of the trees, Mark heard it. The unmistakable crack of a rifle being aimed, the sharp sound of the bolt being pulled back, followed by the deep, guttural voice of Keen. "You can't run forever, Sergeant," Keen shouted, through the storm, his voice cutting through the air. "I'll find you. You can't protect her from me." Mark stopped in his tracks, instinctively pushing the girl behind him as he raised his rifle, scanning the forest for the source of the sound. The storm had already obscured the area ahead, but Keen's voice, laced with menace, was clear. Keen's soldiers were closing in, moving with precision. They were ready. They'd anticipated Mark's every move. "Rex!" Mark barked, and the K9 responded immediately, rushing forward as if the world itself depended on it. The dog's bark rang out through the trees, a signal to Mark. It was time. "Stay low and stay behind me," Mark ordered the girl in a firm, low voice, his heart racing. "Don't make a sound." The girl nodded, her face pale with fear. But she didn't speak. Mark didn't expect her to. Words didn't matter in moments like this. Mark moved quickly, crouching low behind the nearest snow-covered boulder, his rifle aimed ahead as he waited for the right moment. His fingers tightened around the trigger, his breath steady as he prepared for the fight he knew was coming. Rex was already ahead, flanking the soldiers with deadly precision. The dog's body moved with purpose, darting between the trees, positioning itself for the ambush Mark had planned. The K9 was silent but deadly, and Mark had complete faith in its abilities. Suddenly there was a burst of gunfire, the sound of it tearing through the air as Keen's men opened fire. Mark's heart lurched in his chest, but his training kicked in. He pulled the trigger, his aim precise, and one of the soldiers dropped, falling backward into the snow. Another shot rang out, and Mark ducked, narrowly avoiding the second soldier's return fire. The snow around him exploded as bullets tore through the air, but Mark was already moving. He fired back, hitting the second soldier in the leg. The man went down with a grunt, but there were more coming. There were always more. "Move!" Mark shouted to the girl, pulling her along behind him as he sprinted toward the trees, keeping low. The rifle fire continued behind them, but he didn't look back. He couldn't. The girl was too important. Rex was ahead, barking and growling, alerting Mark to the position of the remaining soldiers. The K9 was still moving, guiding them toward safety. The girl stumbled, her small body struggling to keep up with the pace Mark had set. He pulled her forward, gritting his teeth as he pushed past the pain in his side, his exhaustion from the battle weighing on him. "We're almost there," Mark murmured, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. As they neared the clearing ahead, Mark could see a small cabin in the distance, half buried in the snow, but offering what seemed like the only chance for shelter. The storm had cleared enough for Mark to make out the outline of the cabin's roof, and he knew that it might be their only hope. "Ruth, are you there?" Mark whispered to himself as he looked ahead, hoping the cabin would offer some kind of refuge. Just as they reached the edge of the clearing, another gunshot rang out. Mark spun, his instincts kicking in. Rex leaped forward, intercepting the soldier who had fired, taking him down with a force that made the snow beneath them shift. But the soldier wasn't alone. Keen's voice cut through the chaos again, this time louder, colder. "I won't let you get away, Sergeant," Keen shouted, his voice laced with rage. Mark knew it wasn't over, not yet. They hadn't reached safety, and Keen wasn't going to stop. With the girl still clutched tightly in his arms, Mark moved swiftly toward the cabin, his rifle aimed at the shadows beyond. He had to get them inside. He wouldn't let Keen win. The storm had not finished yet, and neither had the battle, but Mark had one goal: keep the girl safe. And he would fight until he could fight no more. The cabin was within sight now, just a few more yards. The storm had cleared slightly, but the snow still whipped around in angry gusts, stinging Mark's face as he sprinted forward, pulling the little girl behind him. The K9, Rex, had already reached the cabin door, its body low and alert, its growls echoing off the trees. Mark's heart raced, not just from the effort of running, but from the knowledge that they were running out of time. Keen's voice rang out behind them, sharp and menacing, carried by the wind. "You can't hide from me, Sergeant. You're not getting away this time." Mark didn't look back. There was no time to look back. If they didn't get to the cabin now, they were dead. Keen's men would overtake them, and all of this would have been for nothing. He couldn't let that happen, not when they were so close. "Stay close, keep up," Mark said to the girl, his voice rough. He could hear her small footsteps behind him, but he didn't dare slow down to check on her. She was relying on him now, and he wouldn't fail her. Rex barked once, as though it too understood the urgency of the situation. Mark's pulse quickened, but his focus remained steady. The cabin was only a few feet away now, the door slightly ajar, the interior shrouded in shadow. He could feel the weight of the storm pressing down on them, the cold sinking into his bones, but they were almost there. Mark reached the door, his fingers numb as he pushed it open, slipping inside with the girl. The K9 followed immediately, its eyes scanning the room for threats. Mark pulled the girl in behind him and slammed the door shut with a force that sent a few loose snowflakes falling from the roof. Inside, the cabin was cold but quiet, the flickering light of a single candle illuminating the space. Mark quickly surveyed the room. It was a small, sparse place, just a table, a few chairs, and a wood stove that had long since gone cold. The floor creaked beneath their feet, but there was no sign of life, no sign of danger, at least not yet. Mark turned to the girl, his breath still coming in short bursts from the cold. "Stay here," he said urgently. "Stay low and quiet. Don't move." She nodded without speaking, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. Mark could see how small and fragile she was, her body trembling, her hands still clutching the teddy bear like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. His heart broke for her. No child should ever have to go through this. He turned back toward the door, his hand resting briefly on the hilt of his rifle. The sound of soldiers' boots in the snow was still faint, but growing closer. Keen wouldn't give up that easily. He had known Mark for years, had fought beside him in the past, but now Keen was no friend. Now he was a threat, an enemy who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. The door creaked again, and Mark spun, his rifle raised in an instant. The girl jumped, a sharp gasp escaping her lips. But it wasn't a soldier, it was Rex. The K9's ears perked as it stared intently at the door. Mark's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected Rex to react so sharply unless there was something outside. He rushed to the door, his hand steady on the handle, eyes scanning the snow-covered forest outside. The storm still raged, but through the haze of snow he saw the silhouettes of men approaching, their dark figures barely visible in the shifting white. "They're here," Mark muttered, his voice tight. His hand moved to the rifle strap. "Get ready!" Rex barked again, a sharp, commanding sound that sent a chill down Mark's spine. The K9 was ready to fight. The bond they shared was unspoken, but Mark could feel it, a deep, unwavering connection forged in battle and blood. The soldiers were close now, too close. Mark could hear their voices, the sound of branches snapping underfoot, the unmistakable crunch of boots in the snow. His fingers tightened around his rifle. He had to make this count. They couldn't afford another mistake. Just as he was about to open the door, a voice, low and familiar, rang out through the storm. "Sergeant Whitmore," Keene called, his voice laced with cold malice. Come out, wherever you are." Mark gritted his teeth, keeping his back to the cabin's dim interior, his rifle aimed at the door. He knew Keene's tricks. He knew the way the man operated. Keene wasn't just hunting them down for sport. He wanted something from Mark, and that something wasn't going to be easy to give up. But Mark had a plan. He had no choice but to make it work. The girl's life depended on it. Mark motioned to Rex, his eyes meeting the dog's. The K9's gaze was unwavering, its body tense and ready. Rex understood. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about fighting for something worth saving. The door creaked open just a sliver, enough to see the soldiers through the gap, just enough for Mark to prepare. He moved fast, crouching low as he made his way to the corner of the cabin where he could flank them. Rex was right behind him, moving with a quiet precision that only a trained K9 could achieve. From behind the corner of the cabin, Mark's rifle came to his shoulder in one fluid motion. He fired twice in quick succession. The first soldier dropped, a muffled cry escaping his lips, and the second soldier stumbled back, clutching his chest. The others were too shocked to react immediately, and that gave Mark enough time to move again, ducking behind another snow-covered rock. The sound of gunfire echoed in the air, and Mark's heart raced. He was back in his element now, fighting for survival, protecting what was his. But the fear that gnawed at him had changed. It wasn't just about his own life anymore. It was about her, the girl. She was the one he had to save. The storm outside seemed to intensify, the wind howling as it battered the cabin, but the sound of boots crunching in the snow was unmistakable. Mark's pulse raced as he crouched behind the corner of the cabin, his rifle ready, eyes scanning the snow for any sign of movement. He could hear Keene's men getting closer. They weren't far off now. "Rex," Mark murmured, his voice low but full of urgency. The K9 was crouched beside him, its eyes fixed on the door, alert and ready. Mark could feel the connection between them, the unspoken understanding that Rex would do whatever it took to protect the girl. The little girl was still inside, huddled by the fire, clutching her teddy bear. She had barely spoken since they entered the cabin, but Mark could feel her fear. The danger was real. Keene wasn't just hunting them, he was after something more, and Mark knew he couldn't let the girl fall into his hands. Mark turned to Rex, his hand on the K9's shoulder. "We need to get her out of here." "Keep them distracted," Rex growled softly, a low sound that Mark had come to understand as a signal of readiness. The dog was ready to fight, but Mark had a different plan in mind. This wasn't just about taking down Keene's men, it was about survival, about getting the girl to safety. Mark rose to his feet, keeping his body low as he moved toward the door. He could hear Keene's men getting closer, their voices muffled in the storm. They had to be ready for what came next. As Mark opened the door just enough to slip through, Rex darted out ahead, its body low and its senses heightened. The K9 was a blur of motion, weaving between the trees as it ran to the left of the cabin, barking once to draw the soldiers' attention. Mark followed close behind, keeping to the shadows, his eyes darting between the trees. Behind him, Mark could hear the girl's soft footsteps as she moved to the cabin door, a slight rustle as she peered outside. She was small, fragile, but she had a strength in her, eyes that Mark hadn't seen before. He couldn't afford to lose focus now. As Mark moved farther into the trees, he saw Keene's men emerge from the edge of the forest. 4 soldiers, rifles raised, their eyes scanning the area. Mark's grip tightened on his rifle, ready for the fight. But Keene's voice, cutting through the wind, stopped him. "Whitmore," Keene called, his voice laced with frustration and anger. "You can't keep running forever." You're just delaying the inevitable." Mark's heart skipped a beat. The bitterness in Keen's tone made it clear this wasn't just about a fight. This was personal, and it made Mark question everything he had known about his former comrade. Keen had once been a brother in arms, someone he trusted, but now he was the enemy. Mark couldn't let that sway him. Not now. "Get away from them!" Mark shouted, his voice fierce, his anger rising. He raised his rifle, taking careful aim at the closest soldier. The shot rang out, the impact knocking the soldier back into the snow. The other men scattered, scrambling for cover behind the trees, but Mark was already moving again. He dashed forward, aiming low, his eyes flicking between the trees as he closed in on the soldiers. They weren't as skilled as they thought. Mark had the upper hand. He had the element of surprise. Rex, barking and growling, darted through the snow, its body a blur as it moved in tandem with Mark, its teeth bared, ready to protect. The K9 lunged at one soldier, knocking him to the ground with a powerful force. The soldier tried to get back up, but Rex held him down, its jaws clamped tight on his arm. Mark's heart raced as he swung his rifle toward the remaining soldiers, his hands steady despite the adrenaline flooding his veins. He fired once, hitting the second soldier in the shoulder. The man dropped to the snow, clutching his arm in pain, unable to continue the fight. 2 soldiers left. Mark knew he had to finish this. One soldier tried to move around to Mark's left, but Rex was faster. The K9's body moved like lightning, lunging at the soldier's legs, knocking him to the ground with a ferocious bark. Mark fired once, hitting the soldier in the chest. The man didn't get up. The last soldier was cornered, his rifle trembling in his hands as he backed toward a tree. Mark kept his rifle aimed at the man, his eyes narrowed in concentration. There was no room for hesitation. "Don't move," Mark warned, his voice cold. He didn't need to say more. The soldier understood. His eyes darted between Mark and Rex, who stood ready, its body coiled like a spring. The soldier's rifle dropped to the snow, his hands shaking as he raised them in surrender. Mark didn't trust him, but for now he had no choice. "You're lucky," Mark said flatly, his voice low. "But don't ever think you can get away with this." Mark turned on his heel, motioning for Rex to follow him. The K9 trotted. Behind, its ears flicked forward, alert for any further threats. Mark had no more time for this. The girl needed to get out of here. He moved quickly, stepping through the snow toward the cabin, where Ruth was waiting inside with the girl. He needed to get them to safety. They had fought too long, too hard, to let this moment slip away. As Mark approached the door of the cabin, he looked back at the defeated soldiers in the distance. Keen was still out there, and Mark knew that the battle wasn't over. But for now, they had won. They had survived. Mark opened the door to the cabin, stepping inside. The girl was there, sitting by the fire, her teddy bear clutched tightly in her arms. Ruth looked up at him, her face filled with relief, but there was still a trace of worry in her eyes. "Are you okay?" Ruth asked softly, her voice full of concern. Mark nodded, his chest tight from both exhaustion and relief. "We're safe." For now he turned to the little girl, who looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice so quiet it was almost lost in the wind. "You saved us." Mark's heart ached as he knelt down to her level. "It's not over yet," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I promise, I'll protect you." "Both of you," the girl's small face softened as she looked at him. "You'll never leave us, right?" Mark's heart twisted at her words, but he smiled, though it was bitter-sweet. "I won't," he said. "I won't leave you." As the storm howled outside, Mark knew that the road ahead would be dangerous, but for now he had his purpose. He had found a reason to fight again. And no matter what happened next, he would keep his promise. The storm outside continued to howl, its relentless winds battering the small cabin, as Mark sat beside the fire, his rifle resting at his feet. The warmth of the fire was a welcome contrast to the biting cold of the snowstorm outside, but it did little to ease the tension gnawing at his mind. He had kept the girl safe for now, but how long would it last? Keen and his men were still out there, and Mark knew that they wouldn't stop until they had what they were after. Ruth sat across from him, her eyes full of concern. She had wrapped herself in a thick wool blanket, but even the warmth of the fire couldn't chase away the worry from her face. The girl was asleep in the corner, still clutching her teddy bear, her small body curled up under a pile of blankets. Her exhaustion was evident, but at least she was safe for the moment. "Mark," Ruth said, breaking the silence between them. Her voice was soft, yet firm. "What now?" "What are we going to do?" Mark didn't answer immediately. His eyes drifted to the fire, watching the flickering flames as they danced in the hearth. The crackling of the wood was the only sound in the room, but it didn't bring him any peace. His thoughts were consumed by the image of the soldiers outside, their eyes filled with malice, the way they had hunted him, hunted the girl. He knew Keen would stop at nothing to get to her, and Mark couldn't let that happen. "We stay here for now," Mark said finally, his voice low. "We keep quiet. We wait for the storm to pass." "But they'll come looking for us," Ruth pressed. "They'll track us down." "I know," Mark replied, his jaw tightening. He knew better than anyone how relentless Keen could be, but there was no other choice. For now, staying hidden was their best option. He glanced over at the girl again, her small form curled up in the corner. The sight of her, so fragile and vulnerable, made his stomach tighten with guilt. She had no one else, no family to protect her. Mark couldn't help but feel responsible for her safety. "Ruth," he said after a moment, do you think she knows something about her father?" Ruth looked at him, her brow furrowing slightly. "What do you mean?" Mark shifted his weight, his eyes fixed on the girl. "She said he's not dead, that he's out there, waiting for her." Ruth's gaze softened, a faint flicker of understanding in her eyes. "You think she's telling the truth?" "I don't know," Mark admitted. But the way she said it, there was something in her voice. Something that makes me think there's more to her story. Ruth was silent for a moment, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "It's hard to say. The things she's been through. I can't imagine the pain she's in." Mark nodded, his thoughts heavy. He wanted to believe the girl, wanted to believe that there was hope, some kind of connection between her and her father, someone who could help them. But he knew better than to let hope cloud his judgment. Keen was after something, and that something could be the key to whatever had happened to the girl's father. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Mark rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the exhaustion settle in his bones. He hadn't slept in days, hadn't had a moment to rest since this whole mess had started, but he couldn't stop now. He couldn't give up. He looked over at Ruth again. "We need to know who's after her. We need to find out what Keen wants." Ruth's eyes met his, and she nodded slowly. "But how? We don't even know where to start." Mark stood up, his knees creaking as he moved to the window. The storm outside was still fierce, the swirling snow making it impossible to see much beyond a few feet. But that didn't stop him from watching the trees, his eyes scanning the landscape for any sign of movement. He knew Keen's men were out there, somewhere, waiting for them to slip up. But he wouldn't let them. Not now. Not when they were this close to survival. "We'll figure it out," Mark said, more to himself than to Ruth. "We have to." Just then, Rex barked, its sharp sound cutting through the quiet. Mark's body tensed, and he rushed to the door, his hand on his rifle. Ruth stood quickly, her face filled with concern. "What is it?" Ruth whispered. Mark didn't answer. He was already moving toward the door, his senses on high alert. Rex had heard something. The K9 had been trained to detect even the faintest sounds in the forest, and right now it was sounding the alarm. He opened the door slowly, peering out into the snowstorm. The cold hit him like a slap, but he barely felt it. His focus was entirely on the forest beyond the cabin, where the shadows of trees and the whirling snow made it impossible to see anything clearly. But then, through the haze, Mark saw it. A figure, dark, moving swiftly through the trees, his silhouette barely visible against the white backdrop. It wasn't one of Keen's men, it was someone else. The figure was too far away to make out details, but Mark could feel the danger in the air. Whoever it was, they were close. Too close. Mark stepped back inside, his heart racing. "Ruth, get the girl, we have to move." Now Ruth didn't hesitate. She grabbed the girl who had just woken up, her wide eyes filled with confusion and fear. Mark grabbed his rifle and rushed to the back of the cabin, his thoughts racing. They couldn't stay here any longer. Whoever was out there, they weren't friendly. Mark motioned for Ruth to follow him. "We're leaving. We don't have much time." The storm outside continued to rage, but the cabin was no longer safe. They had to escape before whoever was out there reached them. The girl's father might still be out there somewhere, but that didn't matter now. They had to survive. They had to keep moving. Mark led the way, his rifle ready, and Rex close behind him, its ears alert. The girl clutched her teddy bear, her small hand shaking in Ruth's grip. As they stepped out into the storm, Mark looked back at the cabin one last time. They couldn't afford to linger, but something inside him told him that the danger wasn't over yet. The storm had just begun. The storm whipped around them, cold and relentless, as Mark and Ruth hurried through the deep snow with the girl in tow. Rex was ahead, moving quickly, its body low to the ground, keen eyes darting between trees and underbrush. Mark's heart pounded in his chest, but it wasn't from exhaustion. No, it was the danger they were facing, the gnawing feeling that Keen's men were never far behind. They had to keep moving. The girl, who had clung to Ruth's side in silence since their hasty departure from the cabin, stumbled over the snow. Mark reached out instinctively, catching her small arm before she fell. Her pale face, streaked with exhaustion and fear, looked up at him. Despite everything, her eyes still held that spark of hope, the belief that her father, someone out there, was waiting for her. Mark didn't know if that was true, but he couldn't break her belief. Not yet. "Stay with us," he said softly, his voice a bit more gentle than he'd intended. The girl's tiny hand gripped his, and for a brief moment, he felt the weight of her trust. Ruth glanced over at him. "Do you think they're still following us?" Mark nodded, his gaze hardening. "I'm sure of it. They'll be looking for us. We can't stop until we get farther away." Rex stopped ahead of them, its body tense, ears pricked as it sniffed the air. Mark's instincts flared. Something was wrong. Rex never stopped unless it sensed danger. Mark pulled the rifle from his back, holding it low to avoid any unnecessary noise. He motioned for Ruth to keep the girl low. "We're close to the trees." "Stay here." Ruth's eyes met his, and there was a moment of silent understanding between them. She didn't question him. They both knew what was at stake. Mark crept forward, his boots crunching softly in the snow. The storm had picked up again, and the howling winds were the only sound in the forest, but Mark could feel the tension in the air. Something was out there. As he reached Rex, the canine growled low in its throat, its body vibrating with anticipation. Mark knelt down beside the dog, his hand on its fur, his eyes scanning the trees. A figure moved in the distance, barely visible through the curtain of snow. Mark's heart skipped. He couldn't make out details, just the shape of a man moving quickly but cautiously. Not Keen, not yet. "Stay here, Rex," Mark whispered, and the dog obeyed, staying low as Mark rose to his feet. He had to get a closer look. He moved quickly, his boots silent in the thick snow. As he neared the figure, the man paused, glancing over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the forest. Mark ducked behind a snow-covered boulder, holding his breath. The man had a rifle slung over his shoulder, but it wasn't raised. He didn't look like a soldier. Mark's instinct screamed that something wasn't right. Was he one of Keen's men, or was he someone else? The figure turned and walked in the opposite direction, disappearing into the storm. Mark waited for a moment, still crouched behind the boulder, his muscles tense and ready for action. But the man didn't return. Mark slowly stood, peeking over the rock, his eyes scanning the path ahead. Whoever it was, they weren't a threat. Not yet. Mark turned back toward Ruth and the girl, signaling for them to move. Rex was already at the edge of the trees, watching them closely. Mark's heart thudded heavily in his chest. Every minute felt like an eternity. They couldn't keep running forever, but the girl needed to be safe. And as much as Mark wanted to believe that Keen's pursuit would stop soon, he knew it wouldn't. Keen had made his intentions clear. He wouldn't rest until he had what he wanted. The snow was thicker now, the storm building up again, but Mark could see the faint outline of a narrow path through the trees. He motioned for Ruth to follow him, his hand still on the rifle, but he knew they couldn't make any more noise. Every step had to be careful. The girl was starting to lag behind, her small feet struggling to keep up with their pace. Mark could see her looking around, trying to make sense of the world that had suddenly become so hostile and cold. Mark's throat tightened as he saw the pain in her eyes. She had no one else to rely on. He couldn't fail her. He wouldn't. "We're almost there," Mark said softly, looking back at Ruth and the girl. His voice was firm, but there was no way he could hide the weariness in it. "Just keep moving." Ruth nodded, her face grim but resolute. She kept the girl close, one arm around her shoulders, pulling her forward. Suddenly, a sound broke through the wind, the unmistakable sound of a twig snapping. Mark froze, his rifle raised in an instant. Rex was already ahead, its body coiled and ready to spring into action. "Who's there?" Mark called out, his voice loud enough to carry, but not too loud to alert anyone within earshot. The figure appeared again, stepping out from behind the trees, hands raised in a sign of surrender. Mark's fingers tightened around the rifle, but he didn't shoot. He knew better. Not unless it was necessary. The man was older, his face weathered and lined with age, but there was something in his eyes, a look of quiet desperation, that Mark understood all too well. "I'm not with them," the man said, his voice hoarse from the cold. "I'm just trying to survive." Mark kept his rifle trained on the man, but his gaze softened. The last thing they needed was another fight. "What do you want?" The man looked over Mark's shoulder, his eyes narrowing as he glanced at Ruth and the girl. "I saw you with them," he said, nodding toward the girl. "You're running from Keen, aren't you?" Mark's blood ran cold. He had to admit, the man's presence only confirmed his worst fear. Keen's influence spread further than he had anticipated. He wasn't the only one on the run. "We need to go," Mark said, his voice sharp. "There's no time." The man nodded, stepping aside to allow them through. But as they passed, Mark could feel the weight of his gaze on them. He couldn't help but wonder, who else was out there? What else had Keen done to turn everyone against each other? As they continued their trek through the forest, Mark's grip tightened on the rifle. He couldn't trust anyone anymore, not even those who claimed to be on their side. The only person he could trust was himself, and Rex. "Stay close," Mark said to Ruth, his voice low. They had to get out of there. They couldn't wait any longer. Keen would find them eventually, and when he did, it would be too late. The forest was silent now, save for the howling wind and the crunch of snow beneath their boots. Mark's eyes flicked from tree to tree, his every sense heightened. They were close, too close to the end to turn back now. Ruth, the little girl, and Rex stayed close, following his every move as they pressed forward. The stranger had fallen behind, and Mark was left to question the man's motives. Who was he really? Was he truly just another victim of Keen's manipulation, or did he have his own agenda? Mark had no answers, only the constant gnawing feeling that Keen's web of control stretched further than he ever anticipated. "We're not far," Mark said, his voice low and focused, as he looked back at Ruth and the girl. They had come so far, but the danger was still very much real. Stay close. The girl, whose name Mark still didn't know, nodded but said nothing. Her face was pale and her eyes were filled with a mixture of fear and hope. The same hope that had pulled Mark through every battle, every dark day. But this time, it wasn't just his life on the line. He had made a promise to protect her, to give her a chance at a future she deserved. The faint sound of footsteps in the snow reached Mark's ears. His pulse quickened, but he didn't turn around. He knew who it was. He had known it would come to this. Keen, Mark muttered under his breath, his grip tightening on his rifle. The man was relentless. He would never give up until he got what he wanted. Mark had been hoping for a way out, but that hope was fading. "We need to move faster," Mark said, his eyes scanning the trees for the best escape route. Rex, who had been moving ahead with purpose, suddenly froze, its body tense. The K9 growled softly, its ears flat against its head. Mark didn't have to ask. He knew what it meant. They were surrounded. Mark's mind raced as he pushed the girl behind him. "Stay down," he ordered Ruth, his voice fierce. He couldn't afford to lose anyone now, not when they were so close. Suddenly a sharp, mocking laugh rang out from the trees. "You think you can run from me, Sergeant?" Keen's voice echoed through the forest, cold and cruel. "You really think I'd let you slip away?" Mark's hand gripped the rifle tighter, but he didn't speak. Keen wasn't going to make this easy. He knew that. "You've done enough damage," Keen continued, stepping forward, his silhouette barely visible through the storm. "Now it's time for you to face the consequences." "You and your little girl Mark," didn't flinch. "She's not yours to take," he growled, stepping forward, his eyes locking with Keen's. "Not today. Not ever." There was a tense pause. Keen took a slow, deliberate step toward him, his eyes gleaming with something dark. "You've always been so noble, Sergeant. But you've forgotten something important. People like you don't win. People like you don't survive." Mark's grip tightened on the rifle, and for a moment the world seemed to freeze. The storm howled louder, the cold biting at their skin. But in the midst of it all, Mark felt something stronger than fear. "Rex," Mark said, his voice steady and low, but filled with quiet determination. The K9, who had been circling around Keen's men, suddenly lunged forward, its body a blur, as it darted toward Keen. Keen's eyes widened for a split second before he raised his gun, but before he could fire, Mark was already moving. He lunged toward Keen, his rifle raised. The shot rang out, louder than the storm, but it wasn't Keen who was hit. It was one of his men, the one who had been sneaking up behind Mark. Keen's expression faltered, and for a brief moment he was distracted. It was all Mark needed. He tackled Keen to the ground, both of them tumbling through the snow as Rex latched onto the nearest soldier's leg, pulling him to the ground with a ferocious growl. Mark rolled off Keen, his breath heavy as he aimed his rifle at the man's face. Keen was gasping for air, his body pinned beneath Mark. The two men's eyes locked, and for a moment it felt like time had stopped. "You don't win, Keen," Mark spat, his voice cold as ice. "This ends now." Keen's eyes burned with fury, but Mark wasn't going to wait for him to make a move. With a final, decisive pull of the trigger, ended it. The snow around them was silent once again, save for the sound of Mark's heavy breaths and Rex's growl. The fight was over, but Mark didn't feel victorious. He didn't feel relief. He only felt the weight of his promises to protect the girl, to get them both out of this alive. He stood up slowly, his legs shaking with exhaustion. His rifle still in hand, he looked over at the girl, who was standing quietly behind Ruth, her eyes wide, watching him with a mixture of awe and something else, something Mark couldn't quite name. "It's over," Mark said softly, his voice hoarse. "You're safe now." The girl's small body trembled as she stepped forward, her teddy bear still in her arms. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with wonder, and whispered softly, "You really did it. You kept your promise." Mark felt his chest tighten as he kneeled down in front of her. He had kept his promise, but the road ahead was still uncertain. They weren't out of danger yet, but for the first time in a long while, Mark felt a flicker of hope. He smiled, a soft, bittersweet expression crossing his face. "I told you I would." Ruth stepped forward, pulling the girl into her arms. "We'll be okay now," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Mark could see the relief in her eyes. As the storm began to calm, the small group stood there, the weight of the past slowly lifting from their shoulders. They had made it through the darkness, and though there was still a long road ahead, they were together, and together they would survive.